Well, today as we wrap up this series, 5 ways God uses to grow our faith. Over the last several weeks, we have looked at these 5 things, or actually 4, and today we'll talk about the 5th one. We've looked at practical biblical teaching, about how we talk and we listen when we look at God's Word through messages and through worship, and by doing so, these practical biblical teachings applying to our lives, God grows our faith. We've looked at providential relationships, God bringing in relationships to us to grow our faith, perhaps even challenge our faith by the people He has brought into us. And He's asked us to make ourselves available not only to receive those relationships, but also intentionally to place ourselves in a way that God uses us to grow other people's faith, by us being the catalyst or the tool that God brings a providential relationship into somebody else's life. Practical biblical teaching, providential relationships. Then we looked at private spiritual disciplines, the fuel that we gain, the action step that we personally can take to grow, come alongside God by prayer and Bible study and giving God our first time and our first treasure, and just allowing ourselves to be saturated by intentionally moving ourselves closer to the Lord through our spiritual disciplines. Then last week we talked about personal ministry, about one of the greatest ways God uses to grow our faith is that He blesses us by when we bless others, by when we serve others, by when we step out of our comfort zones and get into a place where God is glorified and others are blessed. Personal ministry, biblical teaching, providential relationships, private spiritual disciplines. And the last one, probably one of the most effective ways God grows our faith, is pivotal circumstances. Here's the main theme of the day, and you can write this down. God uses life-changing events to grow our faith. God uses life-changing events to grow our faith. Can anybody testify to that? Has anybody had an experience in their life that when it happened to you, whether it was positive and or what we perceived as being negative, it challenged us, it changed us, it grew us closer to the Lord by growing our faith? All of us have experienced that in some way or another. Have you noticed times of peace and prosperity and health, even though we enjoy them, perhaps unless we're very intentional about it, it doesn't stretch our faith than what challenging and hardship and trials do. Have you noticed that? Have you noticed the challenges of our lives, the hardships of our lives, the trials of our lives? Typically is where on the other side of it we look back and we say, wow, God really grew me there. Most of the time, the events and circumstances that grow our faith and challenge us are the unpleasant ones, those unexpected phone calls, that information you received that just left you stunned. The shocking news that just drops you to your knees. And suddenly you're faced with these circumstances that are just bigger than you. That you feel like this is out of my control. Anybody? Has anybody been there? When these things happen to us, you just don't know what to do, and you just don't know what just happened, and you're not sure about what the next steps are, and you just feel like you're just in this fog. You're like, what in the world is going on? Sometimes it's even hard to breathe. Due to budgets and reorganization, your services are no longer needed. A house fire or a natural disaster that leaves your home or certain possessions and property in shambles or in rumbles. A diagnosed sickness or cancer, or a spouse saying, I want a divorce. A loss of a loved one, whether it's a parent or a sibling or a child, Lord forbid. Having a special needs child and or a long-term cared loved one or an aged parent. An accident that leaves you or a family member disabled and just financially affected by this tragedy. Pivotal circumstances. And it's in these moments, whether we're religious or not, whether we have a relationship with the Lord or not, it seems like in these particular moments, these pivotal circumstances where people turn to God. Where they're just like, we beg you, God, help us. And somehow, some way, God takes a bad situation, a tragedy and or a challenging hardship, and he turns it into something that grows your faith. I think C.S. Lewis said it best when he said it this way. God whispers to us in our pleasure, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to arouse a deaf world. I find that to be true. Perfect example of that, September 11th, 2001. In the days, weeks, and perhaps even months, it was amazing the attendance record in churches skyrocketed. Some churches doubled, if not tripled, in those days. But as things became normal and people got a grasp on things just kind of settled back into that. But it's amazing to see that in those moments, in that, what in the world just happened? The safety of our nation has just been questioned. And now, where do we turn? In those moments in our lives, those pivotal circumstances, those events, those life-altering events, sometimes they're not accidental, but intentional. God will take those hardships and will leverage them to draw us closer to Him, to allow us to experience His love, His comfort, His peace, to grow our faith, and to gain our trust in Him. James, the brother of Jesus, talks about that and teaches us in James 1. And he says this starting in verse 2 about the hardships and the tests. He says this, "Dear brothers and sisters, when trouble of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy." Kind of an odd statement. But he says why in verse 3. "For we know that when your faith is tested, your endurance," or other translations would say perseverance, your endurance or perseverance has a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing. In other words, when it's complete, you have a mature faith that trusts in God. James is saying that it's not accidental that we face these circumstances in our lives. It's not accidental. This is one of the primary ways and things God uses to grow our faith, to strengthen our faith, to develop our trust into maturity. It's like a muscle. Your muscles are not built by ease and relax and comfort. Muscles is built when there's resistance and when there's challenge and when it's tested. You can write this down. If you're going to put this into an equation about what James is saying, trial plus test of faith, trial plus test of faith plus perseverance equals stronger faith. Let me say that again. Trial plus test of faith plus perseverance equals stronger faith. God almost always, if we allow Him, leverages to do something in us to make our faith stronger by the circumstances that we find ourselves in, these pivotal circumstances. And many times they're not accidental. And it's not just you. Let me just say that off the set. He does this for all of us. It's not just you. He's not pointing you out, picking you out, drawing you out, just dumping on your parade and on your life. No, this is something that He does for all of us. He's not being cruel. And many of us sometimes even view God as being cruel. But on the other side of it, we'll see that it's probably one of the most loving things He can do. There was a story in the Bible that is a perfect illustration of this. On one view, when you look at it, you're like, why? But when you get to the other side of it and you look back on it, you're like, oh, yes, I see. Probably one of the most familiar stories in the Bible. It's the story of Lazarus. Story of Lazarus. In this story, Jesus doesn't just leverage a bad event to grow somebody's faith. In this story, Jesus actually lets a negative event happen intentionally to grow faith. Let's look at it. Verse 1 in chapter 11. A man named Lazarus was sick, and he lived in Bethany with his sisters Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was sick. So the two sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, "Lord, your dear friend is very sick." Okay. So what we've picked up here, what the context of where we're at here in this story, Mary and Martha and Lazarus are close friends of Jesus. Very familiar. Actually, some translation says, Jesus, the one you love, is sick. We find out in other places that actually Mary, Martha, and Lazarus funded Jesus' ministry, or helped fund Jesus' ministry. They believed in who he was, what he did. They got to see all of these beautiful things God did. Now here's an interesting thing. If you got a phone call saying somebody's sick, saying somebody needed your help, they were in the hospital, and it was a dear close friend, what's the first thing you do? You get into the car and you head to the hospital, right? Because you love them. You want to be close to them. You want them to know that there's someone there for them. Mary and Martha send him word, "Hey, Jesus, come, Lazarus is sick, because we know that you have the power that you can heal them. We've seen you heal strangers. Come. He's sick." We're not just talking about a cold. We're talking about a life-threatening illness. He's on his deathbed. So they expected Jesus would hurry, right? That he would hurry. But look what Jesus says after the hearing about Lazarus. He says this in verse 4. But when Jesus heard about it, he said, "Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for what? For the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this." So the disciples are thinking, "Oh, cool. We're going to see another miracle, and it's going to be one of our friends." Verse 5. So although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. What? Wait a minute. This is their best friends. Jesus just said, this will not end in death. So everybody's thinking, yeah, Jesus is going to go heal Lazarus. Verse 7. So 2 days has passed. Finally, he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. After 2 days of waiting, after doing nothing, Jesus decides to go visit Mary and Martha, knowing that Lazarus was dead. We know this because verse 11. Then he said, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I will go and wake him up." The disciples said, "Lord, if he's sleeping, he will soon get better." They thought Jesus meant that Lazarus was just simply sleeping, but Jesus meant that Lazarus had died. So he makes the record straight. Verse 14. So he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. Then verse 15. Such an interesting statement. "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake. I'm glad I wasn't there, for now you will really believe. Come, let's go see him." What? You intentionally stayed back 2 days so one of your closest friends, one who believes in you, one who supports your ministry, yet just let him die. Yes. Why? For your sake. What? Jesus, like, you want to know why we stayed here? To grow your faith. And they're like, you'd let Lazarus die to grow our faith? Jesus is like, absolutely. Because, as Paul Harvey says, and now the rest of the story. But on that side, before you learn the rest of the story, when you're in the middle of it, it's hard to believe, God, what in the world are you doing? Why did you let this happen? That was Martha's response. Look at verse 21. When Jesus and his disciples are coming down the road, he sees, and she just makes a beeline to him because she's got something to say. Have you ever been that way? Where you just got something to say. Because something did not end up the way that you thought it should. Verse 21, Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died." In other words, it's your fault. How many times have we blamed God for something in our lives? And you know what? Perhaps sometimes you're correct. But we'll see here in a minute, it's not that he's cruel or he's picking on you, but there's something he wants to accomplish because of it. Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. But look at her faith in verse 22. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. And Martha gets all churchy and theology on her. Yes, I know, he'll rise when everyone else rises in the last day. Verse 25, Jesus says, Martha, you don't understand. I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? And it's the same question he's asking you. The pivotal circumstances in your life when things just go sideways or you just feel like you're just getting dumped on. Do you believe that God is bigger than this physical life? Now, folks, you don't make a statement like that without backing it up. I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live for eternity. For what he is about to do, he knows he needs to do to stretch, especially the 12, because he knows what's coming down the road here. He knows that he's going to be falsely arrested, falsely tried, and then he's going to be hung on a cross, and he knows that he's going to step out of the tomb. But he also knows that days later, he's going to ascend to the Father, and the Holy Spirit's going to come on Pentecost. He knows all that, but he wants to increase their faith, knowing, to remember, these are the things that I have accomplished, that I have done for you to grow your faith, because you're going to need them. Do you believe? And he backs it up. Verse 39. Roll the stone aside, Jesus told them. And Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, Lord, he has been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible. But King James say, he stinketh. 40. Jesus responded, didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe? So they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to the heaven and said, Lord, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me. But I said it out loud for why? For the sake of all these people standing here, so that they will believe you sent me. Then Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out! And the dead man came out. His hands and feet were bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in the headcloth. And Jesus told them, unwrap him, let him go. Here it is, verse 45. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did, say it with me, put their faith in. See, Jesus didn't simply leverage a painful, pivotal circumstance. He created one in order to grow and develop their faith. Trial plus testing of faith plus perseverance equals stronger faith. That equation works every time. Each and every one of us will face pivotal circumstances, positive and negative. Circumstances that will stretch us, maybe rock us to the core. But if we persevere or endure, as it says, that means believe through that circumstance, God will take that pivotal circumstance and will turn it into something that will bless us and that will bring Him glory. You have to have both of those truly to let your faith grow. Something that blesses us and something that brings Him glory. And for that to happen, our responsibility is how we respond It's how we respond. It's how we endure or how we persevere through it. Because when it comes to pivotal circumstances or life-changing events, you can write this down. Believe God is doing something in us, not to us. That's so important. To believe that God is doing something in us, not to us. Because when it feels like God is doing something to us, that's when we throw the victim card down. That's when we start doubting God. That's when we start blaming God. That's when we accuse God of being cruel and unloving and unfair and unjust, not powerful enough, or not loving enough. That's the whole mentality of to us. But when we approach something, when something happens in our lives, and we remember, what is God wanting to do in us? That changes the whole dynamic, doesn't it? Because the truth is, that is exactly what God is wanting to do. Something in us. When you can begin to understand it, and it may take days, it may take weeks, perhaps it may even take months, and Lord forbid it will take years. But when you come to that realization that God is doing something in us instead of to us, that's when our faith is going to grow. That's when our trust is going to draw us to Him. That's when our faith is going to mature. The maturity that James talks about. Consider it pure joy when you are faced with trials and hardships. Why? Because that's when we grow in faith and our trust and our maturity in Him. And that's when we reap the blessings of the spiritual fruit that God has available to us. So my challenge to me and to us and to all who are hearing my voice today, allow your faith to take the step of when perhaps you're in the situation right now. And you needed to hear this because you're approaching it right now, this circumstance, with something is happening to you instead of something that's happening in you. Change your perspective of knowing God, and even asking, what are you wanting to do in me through this circumstance? Trust that God will take something bad and turn it into something beautiful. Because Romans 8:28 says this, and we know that God causes, what's the word? Everything. The good stuff, the bad stuff. The positive stuff, the negative stuff. The positive pivotal circumstances and the negative pivotal circumstances. And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose for them. What matters to God? Our faith matters to God. Our restored trust in Him. He's had that as His MO, His mission, since the Garden of Eden. to restore trust, to grow our faith, so that we can have a relationship. God's agenda has been to restore the trust that has been broken. And he will leverage anything and everything to grow our faith and trust in him. He will use practical teaching, providential relationships, private disciplines, personal ministry, and especially pivotal circumstances for our good and for his glory. Amen.